A pleasure to be here, absolutely. Ani, Bojo, Neil Debassige, Dijnikas, Chiging Donjaba, Nido Minising Donjaba. I'm from Manitoulin Island, and I am born and raised on a First Nation here, one of 6 First Nations on the island, Chiging First Nation. So I'm going to share my screen very quickly here, and we're going to jump right into our discussion today, which I'm very happy to be a part of, as I mentioned earlier. So let's start the slideshow. So we're going to talk today about bridging the early literacy gap, and specifically about how to work hand in hand to build the capacity of your educators and improve their efficacy when it comes to literacy instruction. We're going to start our meeting off as we do in a good way with a territorial acknowledgement. And so we acknowledge the traditional ancestral territory of the First Nation people in our respective locations on which we are learning, working, and gathering today. We pay our respects to the members, past and present, with honor and gratitude as they've stewarded the land throughout the generations. I'm confident that we'll continue to work together in harmony with the best of intentions. Miigwech, miigwech, miigwech. So I'm going to jump right in, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what success looks like. And it's kind of ironic. I'm going to share something that I laughed when I was sharing it with Nikki about going to a conference and hearing something that stuck with me early in my administrative career. 85% of professional development that happens off campus stays off campus. And when I heard this, I just started thinking about the dollars that we spend when it comes to sending teachers and administrators like myself at the time going away and listening to speakers and being inspired and thinking how great of an idea I just heard and being all fired up to implement it. And then I get back and I get stuck in the routine and we don't implement it. And the backstory of how I came to work with the Learning Bar and Confident Learners in particular was exactly that. I was sitting in a conference, a workshop a couple of years later, and it was obviously one I shouldn't have signed up for, that workshop. So I left and I listened. I stumbled upon Dr. Doug Wilms, who I didn't know at the time, and he was embarking on this journey of wanting to change literacy outcomes, in particular for First Nation students at the time. And I listened outside the door, and I didn't need to listen very, very long. That was where I needed to be. I jumped into that workshop and was enthralled, and we actually signed up to be a participant in the development of what was going to be the Confident Learners literacy program. And I know we've got some administrators on today, and I really wanted to start this off with this notion of professional development that happens off campus. How do we start to change professional practice in our classrooms with meaningful PD? And this is what we're going to get to talk about today. In our talks that we've traveled all over North America doing, we ask the participants right off the bat, what does success look like in your learners? And today we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the new approach to literacy development. We're going to talk about how we build capacity for educators and how we use a structured assessment and monitoring to target that instruction. We've worked hand in hand with our teachers and our parents to try and ensure that every child becomes a confident learner. And that starts, first of all, in our opinion, by becoming a confident reader. So that's how we're going to lay that out. The vision, for those of you that don't know, of the Learning Bar and of Confident Learners, the vision of success is that children are grounded in who they are. You know, that identity is a big piece. Equipped with the tools to succeed both inside and outside of the classroom. And this is important, the grounding piece, and then equipping them with those tools. So when we do these polls to our administrators and to our educators in different areas, whether in provincial systems or First Nation systems, when we poll those educators, the responses are very similar. And you guys would be, I'm sure if we took the time to poll this audience, it would be very similar as well. What does a successful learner look like? They're confident, they're resilient, and they have the strength to persevere, and that determination to persevere. We've instilled in them a love of learning, and a lot of times that comes from and that confidence comes from literacy, self-discipline and control, self-control, organization. We know that our secondary students, those that have that organized approach to their courses of study, tend to be successful. Numeracy is also a big component, self-determination, and of course, identity. And when we look and poll that same audience, it absolutely amazes me. It shouldn't, but it does. That no matter where we are, the barriers to that success are very similar. Lack of support, whether it's from home or at school, a lack of confidence in their skills, in their ability to interpret the curriculum, to understand the curriculum, is a big barrier for many. Peer pressure as they get into the junior and intermediate grades. Of course, socioeconomic status is, inner city schools. Many of our First Nations struggle socioeconomically, but also in many of our provincial systems. Embedded racism and the whole notion of discrimination for any of our vulnerable sectors is a barrier. Attendance, always a big one. And we split that up, not only attendance physically, but also attendance to task when they're at school. And attending to task is something that we talk a little bit about when we're dealing with literacy instruction and time devoted to in our classrooms. Feeling secluded and isolated, not only as a student or a vulnerable student, but also within our schools themselves, right? A lot of times our teachers feel isolated, and they teach behind closed doors, and that is a barrier to success. A lack of a shared vision. Again, now we're talking a little bit more about leadership. When we look at how the school is organized and how policy is developed and implemented through the school, if it's a shared vision, then there's more chances of success. And then, a lot of times our systems have been governed by fear, the fear of saying, I don't know, or I don't know how, whether that's on the part of the student and a self-advocacy piece, but also on the part of teachers and educators, of letting their employers and their supervisors, school administrators know that they weren't prepared. And we're going to really talk about that a lot today. So a fundamental question that we can ask ourselves is, how can it be in G7 countries like Canada and the US, when we're spending what we spend per student, that our students are still facing those challenges of reading and reading at grade 3 by the end of grade 3. And the program for the PISA program, or the program for international studies, I think it's statistics, has come up with this 25 to 30% factor of children that are leaving school still unable to read. And we know that that's only exacerbated in our low socioeconomic societies. In fact, when we look at First Nations across the country, it's actually about 60%, right? We're not graduating, or we're graduating at a rate of 30%. So 70% of our students are struggling to graduate on time. And so that fundamental question, how is that possible when we've got all of this research at our fingertips? We're going to talk about that today. In order to come to the realization of where the solutions lie, then we really need to get at the root of what these binding constraints are. And today we're going to tackle 3 of them. But as you may or may not know, a binding constraint is a problem that, if not addressed first, it prevents the improvement in all of the other areas. And so there's 8 of them that have been identified by Dr. Wilms, and his associates. And this notion of systemic discrimination, this whole colonialized approach to education that was developed, in the industrial era to put together and groups of students so that we could get workers for a specific workforce. We look at upstream vulnerability, especially in our impoverished nations and vulnerable sectors where they don't have the resources prior to coming to school or prenatal health. All of those upstream factors affect downstream vulnerability. Ineffective reading instruction. We're going to talk about this today, this ineffective approach um, to instruct reading. And this is not going to be, although we might see some inadequacies or ineffective, it is in the negative. We're going to try and swing that to the affirmative, but it's coming to that realization that our post-secondary institutes, in terms of our teacher education programs, really need to overhaul what it is we do and what we teach our teachers to do when it comes to literacy instruction. So we're going to talk a lot about that today. Ineffective leadership when it comes to the revolving door of schools, of school administration. I've participated and seen that for myself. Ineffective teaching. So this is now what happens in the classroom. If we have ineffective reading instruction at the post-secondary level at our schools of education, then that's going to translate to ineffective teaching and what we do with the time, the limited amount of time that we have. When we look at this notion of misuse of data and inadequate funding, there are some pieces there that are somewhat out of our control. The inadequate learning should actually be inadequate learning. We're going to talk a little bit about the 100-minute literacy blocks, but when we talk about inadequate learning time, we really need to take a look at the amount of time that teachers get to spend with students. And when we look at that from 0 to 18, the factor that always blows my mind is that we only get students for 9% of their time from 0 to 18, yet we're expected to do all of these things in terms of citizenship, in terms of physical and mental health, in terms of literacy, numeracy, and being a digital citizen. All of those things in 9% of their time when we look, and that's if they attend 100%, not only physically, but also attending to tasks. So that's one of the binding constraints. Misuse of data, that's something that is not covered well at our post-secondary institutes, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in terms of improving our outcomes for our students in school. And then inadequate funding. A lot of these things are out of our control, but we're really going to zero in on 3 of them today. Now, if you've studied, and I'm sure you have, the work of, Fullen, there are, for any education system, there are 4 key questions that absolutely need to be answered. The first is, what do students need to know and be able to do in order to meet our definition of success? And our definition of success varies somewhat provincially, but it also varies within our provinces when we come to First Nations education and those sovereign nations within. Some of that is different, but any system definitely needs to know, what do our students need to demonstrate? And basically that's a curriculum question. The next one is, how do those students demonstrate that they're learning, right? How do we measure their success? Ultimately an assessment and evaluation question. What is our response if they're not successful? So, this leans toward our special education questions, but it also is, what if the curriculum is too easy and they're demonstrating and that they're getting it, or what if it's too hard? What if we're not seeing those results? And what is our response to that? And then lastly, and this one is a big one for me, for administration and as a teachers, how does the community privilege education where you're at, right? Where are you in terms of community input? In our private schools, we see a big involvement from the parent component. Does that have to do with socioeconomics? Probably somewhat. But when we're looking at our impoverished communities, how do they privilege that? What is their buy-in, or is there buy-in at all? And how much work can we do, especially when it comes to that factor of 9%. We only have them at 9% of their time, and that's 0 to 18. How can we barter and buy back some of that time by improving our relationships with our community, with our adult caregiver programs? Those are 4 key questions that any system needs to be able to answer in education. One of the things that Confident Learner does, it starts to take a look at several of those questions. And the Confident Learner program and the Learning Bar itself has developed a systematic and explicit approach to literacy development. We've looked at a whole school literacy program. We're going to focus on the primary division, but it's definitely something when it comes to the professional development framework that when I was on the front line, both in administration and as a directorship, we ensured that all teachers and all educators participated in what they needed to know. Because if you're in administration, you already know that the only way to improve student outcomes and student achievement is through changing professional practice. It is the best way to do it. The biggest predictor of whether that's going to change is for sure attendance. But if you're looking at changing your student achievement, we have to be looking at changing our professional practice. So the first binding constraint is this ineffective reading instruction, this approach to teaching reading. And many schools across Canada use an approach called the whole language approach, relying on things like memorization, cues, any of those types of approaches to discover meaning in words. But evidence indicates that children actually learn to read more quickly and efficiently if they're initially taught with this structured approach, this structured phonics approach to reading. And this notion is absolutely important at the teachers college levels, at our schools of education, because we're not spending enough time in the science of reading, which we'll talk a little bit more about, of what it entails and what has to happen sequentially for our students in order for them to be able to pick up all of those skills along the way that allow them to be an effective and fluent reader. So we're going to think a little bit differently in this, and Confident Learners does that. It brings to bear the science of learning how to read. It includes a rigorous curriculum aligned with a multitude of teaching activities and assessments. So we're going to address that assessment and evaluation component. One of the reasons that I was such an advocate for the program was this notion of in-house PD. So this quality of professional development when it comes to teaching and instructing our educators how to teach reading is something that we have to bring back to the basics and make sure that our teachers understand the mechanics of all of that, and then provide them with those tools to increase their efficacy. And of course, we always want to support communities and families to ensure children become these fluent readers, as not only as teachers, but also as administrators. This is really about numbers. When we're talking about promoting this sharing of knowledge between our educators and our communities, one of the statistics that changed the direction of my career was this numbers game one. With time. And we know as educators that
Neil,
sure.
Sorry, Neil. Would you mind just turning your camera off just during the presentation? We're having a little bit of a
Absolutely
problem.
do that.
Yeah, thank you.
So one of the statistics there was that 89% of students that learn to read by the end of grade 3 at grade 3 go on to graduate on time. And this is a huge yardstick of measurement especially for First Nation students, but for any learner. because we know as educators that this is where the curriculum changes. Grade 3 is where we spend up to grade 3, kindergarten to grade 3 is where we're learning to read. And in grade 4, the curriculum changes direction somewhat. You need to read to learn, and you need to know how to read to learn. And as an administrator, some of you might be able to relate to this, that love of learning in our kindergartens and in our grade 1, 2, and 3, you know, those little learners are always trying to please the teacher, right? And it's a ton of work, but they just have this love of learning. But as those gaps start to present themselves, especially in terms of literacy, frustration grows. And as students move from the junior grades into the intermediate grades, if there are blocks in there, if there are gaps in there, we start to see behaviors of frustration in our students. Typically, it happens earlier with our boys in the experience I've had, but we definitely start to see that because the curriculum starts to frustrate them because they can't interpret it the way they need to and are expected to by their teachers. So the Confident Learners program is based on the simple view of reading. And I think many of us have seen and read about this. And this notion of it being a skills approach. So we've got code-related skills and language-related skills, and then we drill that down into some specific categories: concepts about print, phonological awareness, letter knowledge, and reading fluency in the code-related skills. But then we, as they develop from kindergarten to grade 3 in their language-related skills, that ability to interpret both spoken and written language, we've got things like vocab, receptive and expressive languages, and language, and then the ability to write the language itself. And the Confident Learner program is specifically based on this, the science behind the simple view of reading. So when we're looking at kindergarten to grade 3, we've broken it into phases. Phase 1, becoming a reader. So this is that systematic phonics instruction that is absolutely necessary to get the skills needed in phase 1. And as they develop into, I don't want to say grade 2 because it's not a grade-based program, but as they're moving along their development into phase 2, and they start to become a skilled reader. And this is that morphology instruction. This is where our teachers really need to understand what's happening in the science behind becoming a skilled reader. And then as they move toward the end of grade 3 and beginning of grade 4, that becoming a confident learner means this instruction on comprehension, this expressive, receptive, and written component to learning, to literacy, and to learning the language. And if we look at this particular slide, the science behind this is very important. So when we look at the code-related skills, right here, these are all of the skills around concepts of print, phonological awareness, phonemic awareness, supraphonemic awareness. These early on indicators are in that phase 1. In the middle here, we've got phase 2, and this is where we see things like reading fluency. And as we get into reading fluency or advance into reading fluency and accuracy, then we look at the speed at which they're able to do that. But this particular slide, if we were to overlay it, we can see phase 1 here being that systematic phonics instruction, the skilled reader being phase 2, and then becoming a reader, a confident learner being that phase 3 as it correlates to this. All of these are indicators here that are developed by linguists and at the team at Confident Learners about the things that need to be in place when the learners are progressing from kindergarten to grade 3. So in becoming a reader, this phase 1, this is a 15-module program. I think many schools have adopted the 100-minute literacy blocks. So when we say 2 literacy blocks, we're actually talking about 2 50-minute blocks or 100 minutes of uninterrupted literacy instruction. We're going to focus on those reading skills, and we're going to look at the notion of blended learning in terms of administrators, teachers, parents, and caregivers, with our student assessments being teacher friendly. Now, we've seen lots of programs in the past where the assessment was cumbersome for teachers. And if you've ever been in a primary classroom, it is very, very busy. And there's not a whole lot of time for one-on-one assessments often. So the program was developed with that in mind, and that the assessments are short and teacher friendly. And then also this becoming a Reader Phase 1 program has weekly check-ins with a PLC coach that comes from the learning bar end of things. So when we're looking at the components here, and we're going to get a little bit more into drilling down into here, but from research informing practice, the science of reading is, we talked about that simple view of reading, a theory that defines all of those skills, especially when it comes to coding. The research behind it informs what teachers are going to do in practice. And it is a systematic phonics framework. I can't express this enough. There are lessons involved for teaching reading with activities associated with it. Teachers are also going to be developed professionally with a course on the science of teaching. So it's a competency framework for quality teaching. What does it look like? What are we striving to achieve in the classroom? Aligning that research with effective teaching, and then moving that into the classroom so that teachers are reflective in what they're doing. There are 15 lessons to improve their core competencies, and we do that through professional learning communities. A lot of our schools now are making specific time available, whether it's release time or time during the regular school week, for PLC discussions to happen, where discourse happens, where it's a to and fro of asking questions and getting some discourse. And then the science of assessment, a big one here for data usage, collecting, analyzing, and reporting on this data based on what we're going to see in practice, this progress, monitoring, and formative skill assessments being delivered by teachers to give them the data they need to have in order to move their students forward in achievement. Confident Learners is really about a shift in thinking and practice. The Confident Learner program requires us to shift our thinking in 3 important ways. We're looking at adopting a skills-based approach instead of a deficit approach. And what we mean by that is it's not about what you don't know, it's about where you are and where we want you to go next. We want to teach skills rather than following this specific grade-based curriculum, because all of our students are at different skill levels and regardless of what grade they're in. So we want to address where those gaps are and teach where the students are in terms of skill. And then we're going to focus on measurable objectives, and then on the activities that will help move that achievement forward. Confident Learners is all about building educator capacity. So along with the science of reading, teaching, and assessment with classroom practice, we also have, or with that, we have those courses named as such. It really starts to look at the binding constraint number 5, is this set of instructional practice that allow students, regardless of their ability and culture, to become these successful learners and become successful readers. And this has to happen through PD. Again, not harping on the ton of things that need to happen at our post-secondary institutions in terms of teachers' colleges, but we really need to hone in on what our teachers are learning so that this changes their practice right from the get-go. And if they don't have those skills yet, then we can do that through some professional development in-house. We know that sustainable literacy results to have this, that our educators need the knowledge and skill. Building capacity saves them time. Improving the efficacy of instruction allows us to see results. It builds confidence not only in the system, but it builds confidence in parents, in what we're trying to do through the school system. And then the monitoring of progress becomes this data-driven approach to our professional learning communities. I'm sure you've all talked about the 6 characteristics of a professional learning community, and being data-driven is those. So in the professional learning series with Confident Learners, we've got that science of assessment, we've got the science of reading, and the science of teaching. So we want to equip those educators with those tools so that the children learn those skills, and we're aware of what skills they need to acquire to become fluent readers. And then also increasing that understanding in our educators of how children learn. How does that progress as they are moving from kindergarten all the way through to the end of grade 3? I'm going to fly through this because this is something that you can read. It's definitely on the website. The science of reading is based on modules. It's a 4-course module program. So we talk about the simple view of reading, which I showed you earlier. We talk about high yield teaching strategies and what it means for an active teaching lesson, coding skills, and looking at those domains of decoding, and then how to teach language comprehension skills in the science of reading. In the science of teaching course, educators gain this understanding of what to do in the classroom, those skills required. There's 6 modules there on improving teaching skills. A lot of that first module is based on reflection, what they're doing now. And then this notion of CQI, right? This continuous quality improvement. What does quality look like? How do we get there? And then once we're there, how do we continue to strive to improve on that? Student engagement, we talk about that in module 3. Culture, context, and climate, deepening our knowledge and how culture affects learning. We talk a lot about learning time. I mentioned it earlier. And then module 6 is this professional engagement, your role in the PLC and in your next stage of your professional development as an educator. And then binding constraints. Number 7, that this use of data. Now, we have a lot of data. What we do with it is the next step. So this use is effective when we're using it to inform us about what to do next to improve student achievement. And we talk a lot about this in our program, because we know that if we're not data driven, if we don't measure it, we're not going to improve it. And a lot of the assessments are not in real time, right? In other programs, and in this program, it allows the ease of teacher assessments allows teachers to pinpoint where the gap is, and we're not waiting till the end of report card period to see where students are. We're going to address it on the fly. So that's this course of the science of assessment. Again, 5 modules: usable data, child and parent, classroom data, how to use data development, capacity development in terms of building that data. So when we look at this structured assessment piece, this is where our teachers are really interested in a lot of the times, because it's how do we identify the gap? How do we target instruction effectively? And that approach to monitoring that is really looking at development of skills being the primary focus, and taking this understanding that our monitoring efforts need to be directly linked to our school policy and practice. And this is an administrative piece, right? So that we can provide results that are transparent to all stakeholders. When parents start to see the results and start to see their children becoming more
Neil, are you there? I think we might have lost connection. Can you hear me?
I'm sorry, was there a question?
No, sorry, I thought I'd lost your connection then.
Okay,
you're back.
Am I back on?
Yes, you are.
Okay, that's Elon Musk. I'm gonna shake my fist at him for my Starlink. But So the big question that teachers want to know, what does the assessment look like? Now, this is really questions can really go deep by our literacy resource specialists, but I do know that the Phonics Advantage reading assessment is an online assessment designed to assess those phase 1 reading skills that we talked about earlier in kindergarten to grade 2. And it's I do know that it's short in nature, 1 to 5 minutes, that teachers take a look and do the assessment to give them the insight of where that particular learner is. It's a skills-based assessment that is systematic in determining what skills students know now and then where they can go next. And then there's some instruction on coaching on instruction there. So it would look like this, basically based on challenges. So we've got challenges here, and students are rated, for example, concepts about print, on whether or not they can do that and how well they can do it. And we're aiming for a level 4 there. And there's obviously assessment rules in terms of when to stop the assessment. So what it would look like here in terms of a classroom, we've got Alma here, who, if this was concepts about print in this particular challenge, she's doing really well here, as opposed to Manoj, who maybe here we know that there's some struggling here, and these are the skills that we need to work on specifically. We want to be in that 3 and 4 level, but then this starts to give us an idea as a classroom teacher of where our students are and what skills they have and where those gaps may or may not be forming. So this program works hand in hand to making sure that every child becomes a confident reader. We know that confident readers become confident learners, that we want to work with capacity development of our educators, that we want to work with the capacity development of our administrators, and also bridge that gap between home and school. We know that we want to take a conscious stand to overcome those binding constraints that face our learners, and empowerment is key, not only with educators and their skill and knowledge, but also to connect practice, research to practice, and change what we're doing and how we're instructing in the classroom. And that is always in any system that is going to be improved, it's driven by data for improvement.